Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Last week, Joe Biden turned in his final inflation number. This is the inflation he will be handing to Donald Trump. Annualized, it came in at 5.7%. Food prices hit another record high in Biden's dying days. Now, that's up from 3.8% the previous month, and it's the highest inflation in 17 months. Meanwhile, producer prices, which are the prices companies have to pay, jumped nearly 20% annualized. Now, that's a very volatile index, but it's also one heck of a number and the highest since the darkest days of Biden inflation. Not since Jimmy Carter has a president handed off such a mess of an economy. Now, I'm old enough to remember 18 months ago when Paul Krugman announced, quote, "The war on inflation has been won at very little cost." Of course, that was false, fake news, you might even say, with ongoing inflation being a major reason cackles lost. Well, that along with open borders, men and girls room, and funding Ukraine instead of North Carolina. In fact, Biden's inflation had been getting worse every single month since last June, when it was flat on the month. So we had June at 0, July and August at 2.1%, September and October at 2.8%, November at 3.4%, December at 4.5%, and now January at 5.7% annualized. Spot the trend. Now keep in mind, these are all official numbers, so shenanigans like the Bureau of Labor Statistics pretending that health insurance dropped 18% under Biden, or they don't count interest costs, which have soared, these all mean that the reality on the ground is much worse. Of course, our tax-funded left-wing media pounced on Biden's numbers to attack Donald Trump. The New York Times positively giggled how, quote, "inflation is Trump's problem now." CNN literally copied their headlines, since I guess they use AI now. The Guardian went with, quote, "inflation picks up speed after Trump promised to bring down prices." So it's Biden's inflation, but it's Trump's fault. So what's next? Biden was steering us into a near-perfect repeat of the 1970s double inflation catastrophe. What caused the 70s, of course, was that government never cut spending. So Congress in the 70s would not let go of a single dollar of the warfare welfare state that was bankrupting us and is still bankrupting us. It only ended when Paul Volcker's Fed manned up and hiked rates to 19%, causing a series of catastrophic recessions that absorbed the first half of Ronald Reagan's presidency. This time around, the Fed will not help, since our banking system is so flimsy that additional hikes could wipe out hundreds of banks, meaning it is up to Trump. That means tax cuts and deregulation to boost production, deporting enough migrants to drop housing costs even as blue-collar wages rise, and above all, the DOGE-driven cuts in federal spending that not only help inflation, but could permanently bend the curve by defunding the activist industrial complex that drives the welfare warfare state. Biden put us on a knife's edge on inflation and recession. Trump will need to move fast. Winter has come for federal workers as they cry into their TikToks. The Wall Street Journal reports that over 75,000 federal workers have accepted Trump's severance packages, which were paused by a left-wing judge but are now back on. Now, 75,000 is just over 3% of federal workers, and it would save about $80 billion a year in salaries alone. Still, the administration had been hoping for more, given on average 62,000 federal workers retire every year anyway. Plus, 8 months was a very generous buyout offer. So why so few? Two reasons. An all-out effort by government unions to scare workers out of buyouts, claiming they're illegal or won't be honored. But the biggest reason is federal workers are grotesquely overpaid, and they have zero hope of making anywhere near that money in the real economy. So on average, federal salaries are roughly $40,000 more than the rest of us make, plus benefits that might double that. And you actually have to work in the real world. So if these guys are making $150,000 to not work from home, they've got 6-figure lifestyles, 7-figure mortgages, and no private salary will cover that. Meaning they will cling on, praying union lawfare lets them squeeze another couple $100,000 from taxpayers, while complaining on TikTok about brutal DOGE interviews where they're asked, like, what they actually do. Still, voluntary buyouts was just the first salvo to catch the low-hanging fruit. Now begins the fun part, going from carrot to stick, the mass firings that will be a whole lot less generous than 8 months severance. The administration's already sent out over 200,000 pink slips to recent probationary hires, and they're telegraphing that any federal parasite who stays will have to step up and actually do competent work or they will be out. They'll have to come to the office 5 days a week, which is apparently traumatic going by federal workers crying on TikTok, and they'll be subject to performance reviews, which government workers probably did not know were real. This all relies on Supreme Court decisions going back to 1926, allowing termination of federal workers for, quote, inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance. So inefficiency alone probably covers 90% of them. In fact, thousands of federal workers are already being axed. Beyond the 200,000 probationaries, left-wing slush fund USAID immediately placed 10,000 employees on leave, while up to 5,000 FBI agents could be purged for politically weaponizing the agency. More than 1,000 EPA employees were informed they are now probationary under review, including over 100 EPA, quote, environmental justice workers, who you probably didn't know you were paying. Even the CIA got an unprecedented buyout offer, a shot across the bow warning that they too are on the list. So what's next? Decimating the federal parasitocracy is fantastic for the economy and for the American people. I mentioned in a recent video how a single regulator costs 158 jobs, according to Mercatus. More, it will go a long ways to reestablishing that the bureaucrats serve the people, we the people do not serve them. Now, the last time we had a real federal cull was Andrew Jackson, who fired roughly half of the federal government in 1829 with no discernible impact on function. Elon may be thinking closer to the 80% he laid off at another sclerotic organization, Twitter, which also functioned better after the layoffs. Either way, there's about to be a lot more crying on TikTok from the dispossessed federal nobility who can no longer feather their beds with our hard-earned tax dollars. A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained.com. In the new year, it's time to think about your annual IRA contributions. An IRA is an investment vehicle that can save you a lot of taxes. With Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, get access to trading, inheritance, and loans, and it's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding your own Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Book a friendly consultation at unchained.com/Peter. You've heard me talk about the need to protect yourself from inflation and central bank currency debasement. Instead of parking your wealth and eroding dollars, there's an alternative: saving and earning interest every month in gold and silver with monetary metals. Gold and silver owners can earn between 2 and 4% on metal leases paid in more ounces of gold and silver. Accredited investors can earn up to 19% in monetary metals precious metal bond offerings. That's real, tangible wealth earning interest every month. This is more than just preserving your wealth. This is growing it in gold and silver that cannot be devalued by the Fed. Visit monetarymetals.com/Peter to learn how to put your gold and silver to work today. Now back to our show. Last week, Vice President J.D. Vance visited Europe and dressed them down like naughty children for Europe's rising authoritarianism, ranging from censoring their own people to literally canceling elections they don't like. The European establishment was aghast. The conference organizer in Munich cried. The German defense minister fumed that defending free speech is, quote, unacceptable, as Germans have in the past. The influential Guardian called it, quote, a brutal ideological assault. Bloomberg, meanwhile, lamented that, quote, the transatlantic alliance as we know it is dead. We can always dream. JD was speaking at a military conference in Munich. Perhaps the Europeans thought they would get another couple tens of billions from Uncle Sucker. Instead, JD came heavy, criticizing the EU's recent cancellation of an election in Romania because the populace won, while Germany mulls a ban on the second most popular party in the country, the AfD, also for the crime of being populist. In fact, prominent Eurocrat Thierry Breton literally threatened to cancel Germany's upcoming election if there's, quote, foreign interference, meaning if the populists win. JD moved on to Europe imprisoning its own people for peaceful speech, including in Britain the crime of silently praying in your own home if an abortion clinic happens to be nearby. Hundreds have been imprisoned for online posts in Britain alone, while European governments justify censorship with the literal Soviet terms misinformation and disinformation. JD called out this censorship with, quote, "You cannot win a democratic mandate by imprisoning your opposition," adding, quote, "If you're running in fear from your own voters, there's nothing America can do for you." In other words, if you keep censoring, we can't be friends. The background here is that Europe has been sliding into Soviet-style authoritarianism. It's very likely Trump and Musk would be in prison if they were Europeans. And yet Europe's kleptocracies need America, meaning they need Trump. But Trump does not need them. I've mentioned in recent videos how the U.S. imports over $600 billion from the EU, yet we export just half that, about $370. Even at the height of the Ukraine war, when we were funding Europe's very existence, imports from Europe grew $30 billion, but our exports to them went up by just 2.5. This means we are far more important to Europe's economy than they are to us on trade alone. In case you wonder why Trump can knock the Europeans around on trade. But much more important is the unpaid mercenary services America gives Europe. We pay 73% of NATO's budget, whose purpose is defending Europe. Without us, Europe would have to double its military spending, meaning we're effectively handing them $200 billion per year in military protection with nothing in return. Of course, that goes to $400 billion when there's a Ukraine involved. Now, for perspective, $200 billion is the entire annual earnings of roughly 6 million Americans. So what's next? The sclerotic authoritarians in Europe have painted themselves into a corner. Their economies are moribund, they haven't had an innovation in roughly a century, and they've become a left-wing welfare queen living on handouts from American taxpayers. As much as they would love to tell JD and Trump to take a hike, they cannot. JD's speech specifically tied free speech and authoritarian behavior to America's generosity, that America can't do anything for you line. So the ball is now in Europe's court to convince Trump why we should be helping them at all. As for JD, 2028 is looking like a very good year for him. DC area Google searches for criminal defense lawyers, wiping hard drives, and offshore banking are spiking as the greatest corruption scandal in our nation's history unfolds. Orders of magnitude what they found on Tricky Dick, and potentially involving millions of government bureaucrats and so-called nonprofits. It all kicked off with Rasmussen reports, who found Google searches for criminal defense lawyers spiked in D.C. after the election, hitting nearly 4 times any other state. Ex-users ran some other terms, and it turns out searches are soaring for RICO statutes, for, quote, the definition of treason, quote, penalties for criminal conspiracy, and statute of limitations, along with Swiss Bank, Offshore Bank, and BleachBit, the tool Hillary Clinton famously used to wipe her hard drives. DC searches for lawyer have soared 400%. In other words, we're going to need bigger prisons. The reason, of course, is that DOGE found the mother lode, the tens of billions, perhaps hundreds of billions, that the deep state has been siphoning from Americans in what is effectively a universal basic income for the entire radical left and its media mouthpieces from Politico to New York Times to the BBC. All of this, of course, is very illegal. The statutory penalty for steering government money to your friends or associates is theft of government property, 10 years, and misuse of public money, also 10 years, unless it's under $100, in which case it's just 1 year. Simply giving campaign funds to relatives, which is apparently common practice in Congress, gets you 5 years. Then, of course, there's the malicious prosecution, not least by the FBI. So perjury gets you 5 years, obstruction of justice is 10 years, tampering with evidence, also 10 years, and destruction, alteration, or falsification of evidence is 20 years for any bureaucrats thinking about resisting DOGE. Now, that's without getting into the definition of treason that bureaucrats are so curious about these days, which is, of course, punishable by execution. In case you wonder why they're fighting DOGE so hard, this isn't just about their livelihoods, this is about 20-year prison sentences. A recent survey found nearly half of federal workers plan to actively resist Trump, which isn't surprising considering precisely 92.5% of DC area votes went to Kamala. But one does wonder how many of those resistors should be in prison instead. So what's next? DC is already emptying out like rats abandoning ship. Zillow recently estimated DC home prices have dropped 15% since the election, $139,000. Homes for sale in DC Metro have jumped by 23%. In some parts of government-infested North Virginia, it's 60 to 70%, and that's before the mass layoffs kick in. Interestingly, the biggest surge in DC area listings are houses over $1 million, suggesting the rats are falling over themselves to get out, either because their U.S. aid blank checks are bouncing or because there is, in fact, a definition of treason. DOGE's anti-corruption crusade has only begun. By the time Elon's done, I don't think Americans will ever look at the federal government the same. A word from our sponsor. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada and they're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. You can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. Okay, back to our show. Last week, Elon Musk suggested the Department of Government Efficiency could audit the mother of slush funds, the Federal Reserve. He even suggested Ron Paul could lead the team. Now, DOGE has already found at least $70 billion in waste and fraud in the federal government. The Fed could ramp that up tenfold. And the Fed could use some sunlight. Economist Murray Rothbard in his book, The Case Against the Fed, famously noted the Federal Reserve has less oversight than the CIA. In fact, you can find videos across the internet of Ron Paul, who was then chair of the House Subcommittee on Monetary Policy, pressing Fed chairs for information only to get smirks from Ben Bernanke or Alan Greenspan, who didn't believe they owed Congress nothing. Raising the question, who exactly runs the Fed? They say it's not the president, apparently it's not Congress, to which the answer is it runs itself, on behalf of the banks who literally own it. So what would an audit of the Fed uncover? There's two big areas. First, how the Fed conducts monetary policy, meaning how much money to print, where to put interest rates, which can spin money for Wall Street either directions. Now, today these decisions are secret. We can only guess how much is negotiated over late-night dinners that touch on future employment prospects. Given Wall Street bankers habitually pay former Fed chairs hundreds of thousands of dollars for speeches, Janet Yellen got over $7 million, we can guess these are fruitful discussions. The second big area is the Fed as slush fund. The Fed currently reports $7 trillion in assets. These were overwhelmingly bought directly from Wall Street or hedge funds, including billions of dollars in overseas so-called swaps, where the Fed just hands dollars to foreign central banks. We have no idea what backroom deals went on to use your dollars to bail out one bank or one hedge fund, but not another, or to bail out one country, remember the tequila crisis, but not another. And in short, they literally printed up $7 trillion, and we have no idea where the dollars went. In fact, without an audit, we have no idea if $7 trillion is the actual number. Maybe it's $9 trillion, maybe it's 12. Who knows how much was printed? Who knows how many counterfeit dollars they dumped into special interests to dilute the dollar's buying power and siphon away America's life savings. Now, a main reason the Fed has never been audited is because it is self-funding. It prints its own budget. The same way a basement counterfeiter prints their own budget. This means the Fed does not go to Congress for budget. In fact, it traditionally hands money to Congress, called remittances, essentially some of the proceeds of its counterfeiting. Now, these were substantial, around $70 billion a year, until Jerome Powell managed to put the Fed $250 billion in the hole. But even in the good old days, they represented just 10% of what the Fed printed every year. The rest, we have no idea where it went. So what's next? The swamp will fight a Fed audit for the same reason they're fighting all the audits. They own the grift. The trick will be communicating to voters just how corrupt Wall Street and the Fed are. A 2022 poll by Ipsos found 93% of Americans say they know little to nothing about the Fed, which the Fed likes just fine. Fortunately, the corruption DOGE is currently uncovering across the federal government can make it crystal clear to this 93% why the mother of slush funds needs the mother of audits. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersanons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.